The yellow school bus sat buried beneath 30 years of dirt, leaves, and silence. When the construction crew's excavator blade scraped against its rusted roof that October morning in 2024, nobody expected to uncover one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The bus that had vanished without a trace on May 13, 1994, along with 20 high school students and their driver, had been hiding just 12 miles from Millbrook High School all along. Detective Ray Morrison had seen plenty of cold cases resurface during his 25 years with the county sheriff's department, but nothing quite like this. As he stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching the yellow metal emerge from its earthen grave like some mechanical fossil, Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The bus looked almost pristine beneath the grime, as if time itself had been holding its breath. "Jesus Christ," whispered Officer Janet Kellaway, Morrison's junior partner. She clutched her notepad with white knuckles, staring at the vehicle that had haunted her childhood nightmares. Like every kid who grew up in Millbrook during the 90s, she remembered the disappearance. How could anyone forget? May 13, 1994 had started like any other Friday at Millbrook High School. Spring semester was winding down, and the academic decathlon team was scheduled for their regular after-school practice session. 20 of the school's brightest students, ages 15 to 18, had boarded bus 47 at exactly 4:15 p.m. for what should have been a routine 20-minute ride to the county library downtown. The driver that day was Thomas Brennan, a 62-year-old grandfather who had been shuttling Millbrook students around for nearly 2 decades. Brennan was known for his punctuality, his clean driving record, and his habit of humming old jazz standards while navigating the winding country roads that connected the school to town. His wife Eleanor would later tell investigators that Thomas had been looking forward to their planned weekend fishing trip to Lake Hartwell. But bus 47 never arrived at the library that afternoon. The first sign of trouble came at 5:30 p.m. when Mrs. Patricia Vance, the academic decathlon coach, told the school's main office to ask why her students hadn't shown up. The secretary, assuming there had been some scheduling confusion, assured her the bus had departed on time. It wasn't until parents started calling around 6:45 p.m., wondering why their children were late for dinner, that anyone realized something was seriously wrong. By 7:30 p.m., Sheriff Harold Tompkins had organized the first search party. The route from Millbrook High to the downtown library was straightforward, mostly traveling along State Route 19, a 2-lane highway that wound through dense pine forests and past a handful of rural properties. There were only 3 possible turns bus 47 could have taken, and search teams covered all of them before midnight. They found nothing. The next 72 hours became a blur of helicopters, search dogs, and volunteers combing every inch of Harrison County. The FBI arrived on Sunday morning, bringing with them sophisticated tracking equipment and a growing sense that this wasn't a simple accident. Roadblocks were established throughout the region. Every bus depot, truck stop, and rest area within a 200-mile radius was searched. Still nothing. And the 20 missing students represented some of Millbrook High's most accomplished young people. There was Emily Patterson, the valedictorian whose parents had already started planning her Harvard send-off party. Kevin Marsh, the debate team captain who could argue both sides of any issue with equal conviction. Luna Santos, whose poetry had been published in 3 literary magazines before her 17th birthday. Then there were the twins, Alex and Jordan Whitmore, whose synchronized thinking had made them legendary on the academic circuit. Their parents, Dr. Michael and Dr. Susan Whitmore, both chemistry professors at the nearby State University, became the unofficial spokespersons for the families during those first terrible weeks. Their composed press conferences and methodical approach to organizing search efforts masked a grief so profound that colleagues worried they might never recover. "These aren't the kind of kids who just run away," Dr. Michael Whitmore told reporters during a press conference on May 20th, exactly 1 week after the disappearance. His wife stood beside him, her normally bright eyes dulled by sleepless nights and endless tears. "These are honor students, kids with bright futures, kids who call home when they are going to be 5 minutes late." The investigation consumed Harrison County. FBI behavioral analysts developed profiles suggesting the disappearance was likely the result of either a carefully planned abduction or a catastrophic accident that had somehow concealed all evidence. Neither theory provided much comfort to the families or the community. Theories sprouted like weeds in the weeks that followed. Some locals whispered about the old mining tunnels that honeycombed the hills around Millbrook, suggesting the bus might have fallen into some forgotten shaft. Others pointed to the proximity of Interstate 75, wondering if the students had somehow been trafficked out of state. A few conspiracy theorists even suggested government involvement, noting the strange military helicopters that had been spotted in the area during the days before the disappearance. The most persistent theory, however, centered on the Bellweather property. Jacob Bellweather owned 847 acres of heavily forested land that bordered State Route 19 about halfway between the school and the library. The property had been in his family for generations, but Jacob himself was something of an enigma. The 43-year-old recluse rarely ventured into town, and when he did, locals noted his strange behavior and intense stare. Some claimed he'd served in Vietnam and come back different. Others suggested he was involved in drug manufacturing, pointing to the unusual amount of traffic that seemed to visit his property at odd hours. Sheriff Tompkins obtained a search warrant for the Bellweather property on May 25th, 2 weeks after the disappearance. The search took 3 days and involved 40 officers, 6 search dogs, and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging equipment. They found nothing related to Bus 47 or its passengers, but they did discover something else that made Jacob Bellweather a person of interest in several other cases. Hidden beneath a tarp in one of his outbuildings, investigators found a collection of items that belonged to other missing persons from the region. A backpack that had belonged to a hiker who vanished in 1991. A wallet that had belonged to a traveling salesman who disappeared in 1993. And a charm bracelet that matched the description of jewelry worn by a college student who had vanished the previous autumn. When confronted with these items, Bellweather claimed he'd found them scattered around his property over the years. He said he'd been meaning to turn them into authorities but had simply forgotten. His explanation was plausible but unsettling, and while investigators couldn't directly link him to any of the disappearances, his property was placed under constant surveillance. And that surveillance would prove crucial in the weeks to come. On the night of June 8th, nearly a month after the disappearance of Bus 47, motion sensors placed around the Bellweather property detected unusual activity. Security cameras captured footage of Jacob Bellweather loading what appeared to be several large, heavy objects into the back of his pickup truck around 2:30 a.m. He then drove deep into the wooded portions of his property, staying off camera for nearly 3 hours before returning with an empty truck bed. When investigators arrived the next morning with another search warrant, they found Jacob Bellweather hanging from a rope in his barn. Pinned to his chest was a handwritten note that read, "I can't live with what I have done. Check the old logging road. Follow the creek upstream." The old logging road hadn't been used since the 1970s and decades of undergrowth had made it nearly impassable. Search teams had to cut their way through using chainsaws and machetes, following the faint outline of what had once been a gravel path. The creek Bellweather had referenced in his note wound through the property like a serpent, disappearing underground in several places before emerging again deeper in the forest. 3 miles from the main road, searchers found the first grave. It was shallow and hastily dug, containing the remains of David Pierce, the traveling salesman who had disappeared in 1993. His car keys were still in his pocket, and his business cards were scattered around the burial site like calling cards left by death itself. 50 yards upstream, they found the college student, buried with her textbooks and the charm bracelet they'd discovered in Bellweather's outbuilding. But there was no sign of Bus 47 or its 20 passengers. The discovery of these other victims confirmed that Jacob Bellweather had been a serial killer, but it also deepened the mystery surrounding the missing students. That Bellweather somehow managed to kill 20 teenagers and hide their bodies so well that even a month-long search couldn't locate them, and the logistics seemed impossible. How does one man overpower 20 healthy young people and their adult driver? How does he dispose of a full-size school bus without leaving any trace? Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, the FBI's lead behavioral analyst on the case, struggled with these questions during her final report in September 1994. The Bellweather connection cannot be ignored, she wrote, but the methodology doesn't match his established pattern. Previous victims were solitary individuals taken during vulnerable moments. The bus disappearance suggests a level of planning and execution that seems beyond Bellweather's capabilities based on our psychological profile. As autumn turned to winter, the investigation gradually wound down. The families of the missing students formed a support group that met monthly at the Millbrook Community Center. They organized annual memorial services and maintained a reward fund that eventually grew to over $200,000. But as the years passed, even the most dedicated investigators began to accept that Bus 47 and its passengers might never be found. The case officially went cold in 1999, though it was never officially closed. Detective Morrison, who had been a rookie officer during the original investigation, inherited the files when the previous lead detective retired in 2003. He made it his personal mission to review every piece of evidence at least once a year, hoping that fresh eyes or new technology might reveal some previously overlooked clue. Morrison's annual review had become something of a ritual. Every May 13th, he would clear his desk, lock his office door, and spread out the entire case file. Crime scene photos, witness statements, search grid maps, evidence logs, and psychological profiles covered every available surface. He would spend the entire day retracing the investigation step by step, looking for patterns or connections that might have been missed. It was during his 2018 review that Morrison first noticed something odd about the soil analysis reports from the Bellweather Property search. The geological survey, conducted to help locate potential burial sites, had identified several areas where the ground showed signs of recent disturbance. Most of these locations had been thoroughly excavated and found to contain either confirmed victims or natural anomalies like fallen trees or animal burrows. But there was one location, marked as Grid Reference 47J, that had never been fully investigated. According to the file notes, Grid Reference 47J showed significant soil disturbance consistent with heavy machinery operation. Ground-penetrating radar had detected what appeared to be a large metallic object, buried approximately 8 feet below the surface. However, the excavation of this site had been postponed when Jacob Bellweather's suicide note led searchers to focus on the creek area. After the discovery of the other victims, 47J had somehow been forgotten in the rush to process evidence and close-related cases. Morrison stared at the faded map notation for nearly an hour, his coffee growing cold as he tried to understand how such an obvious lead could have been overlooked. The coordinates placed 47J in a remote section of the Bellweather property, near what had once been a gravel quarry. The terrain would have been perfect for concealing something as large as a school bus. The next day, Morrison requested permission to conduct a limited excavation at the site. His request was initially denied due to budget constraints and the age of the case, but Morrison was persistent. He argued that new technology might yield better results than the equipment available in 1994, and that the families deserved to have every possible lead investigated. It took Morrison 6 months to obtain the necessary approvals and funding. By the time excavation crews arrived at Grid Reference 47J in March 2019, 25 years had passed since the disappearance of Bus 47. The site was barely recognizable, overgrown with trees that were now taller than telephone poles and brambles thick enough to hide a car. The first day of digging revealed nothing but rocks and tree roots. The second day brought fragments of metal that could have been anything from old farm equipment to discarded car parts. But on the third day, exactly 8 feet below the surface, they found the front bumper of a school bus. Morrison's hands were shaking as he brushed dirt away from the familiar yellow paint. Even after decades of burial, the Millbrook School District logo was still visible on the metal. This was it. This was Bus 47. The excavation process took 2 weeks. Working with archaeological precision, the team slowly revealed the entire vehicle, buried nose down in what appeared to have been a pre-existing pit. The bus was remarkably well preserved, protected from decay by the clay soil and lack of oxygen. Even the tires still held air. But the most shocking discovery came when they finally gained access to the interior. Bus 47 was empty. Every seat, every aisle, every possible hiding place had been thoroughly searched. There were no human remains, no personal belongings, no signs that 20 students and their driver had ever been aboard. The bus looked as if it had been professionally cleaned before burial, with not so much as a gum wrapper or pencil shaving left behind. Morrison stood in the doorway of the excavated bus, trying to process what he was seeing. The vehicle that had haunted his dreams for decades was right here, exactly where the evidence had suggested it would be. But the people it was supposed to contain had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. The passenger manifest was still clipped to the dashboard, Thomas Brennan's careful handwriting listing each student's name and seat assignment. Emily Patterson, seat 4. Kevin Marsh, seat 7. Luna Santos, seat 12. The twins, Alex and Jordan Whitmore, seats 15 and 16. All 20 names accounted for, all 20 seats empty. As Morrison examined the interior more closely, he began to notice details that made his investigation instincts prickle with unease. The seats showed no signs of struggle or violence, but there were subtle indications that people had indeed been aboard the bus when it was buried. Seat cushions were compressed in patterns consistent with human weight. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone of Thomas Brennan's height. The personal items were missing, but the spaces where they should have been were clearly defined by dust patterns and fabric impressions. Most disturbing of all was the emergency exit at the rear of the bus. The exit door was standing wide open, its rubber seals still flexible despite decades of burial. The emergency protocol required that this door remain closed and locked during normal operation, opened only in case of evacuation. The fact that it was open suggested the passengers had indeed evacuated the bus, but when? And why? Morrison called for additional forensic specialists, hoping that modern DNA analysis might reveal traces of the missing passengers. Hair samples, fingerprints, or skin cells might have survived the burial and could finally provide concrete proof of what had happened inside Bus 47. But even this hope was quickly extinguished. The forensic analysis revealed something even more puzzling than an empty bus. According to the DNA and fingerprint evidence, the interior of Bus 47 had been occupied by exactly 21 people on the day it was buried. The genetic material was too degraded to provide individual identification, but the quantity was consistent with 20 students plus one adult driver. More importantly, the positioning of the biological evidence suggested these people had remained in their seats right up until the moment of burial. But if the passengers had been present during burial, where were their remains? The toxicology report provided one possible answer, though it raised even more questions. Trace amounts of a powerful sedative were found throughout the bus interior, concentrated in the ventilation system. The compound, known as Compound X-47, was a military-grade chemical weapons agent that had been developed during the Cold War. In sufficient quantities, X-47 could render a person unconscious within minutes and cause complete paralysis within an hour. More troubling still, Compound X-47 had another property that made it particularly suited for covert operations. When exposed to certain environmental conditions, the chemical would completely dissolve organic matter, leaving behind only trace minerals and synthetic materials. Clothing, hair, skin, even bones would simply vanish, reduced to an odorless powder that could be blown away by the slightest breeze. The implications were staggering. Someone had gassed 20 students and their driver, waited for the chemical to dissolve their bodies completely, and then buried the empty bus as evidence of a perfect crime. But who had access to military chemical weapons? Who possessed the knowledge and equipment necessary to handle such dangerous materials? And why target a random group of high school students? Morrison spent the following months investigating every person who might have had access to Compound X-47. Military records, chemical company employees, university researchers, even government contractors were scrutinized for any connection to Millbrook or the missing students. The trail led nowhere. As 2019 turned to 2020, Morrison found himself facing the same frustration that had plagued the original investigators. He had found Bus 47, confirmed the fate of its passengers, and even identified the method used to kill them. But he was no closer to identifying the perpetrator or understanding the motive behind this elaborate crime. The case was once again at a dead end, but Morrison refused to give up. Somewhere in the evidence, he believed, was the key to solving the greatest mystery in Harrison County history. He just had to find it. What Morrison didn't know was that finding Bus 47 had set other events in motion, events that would soon bring new players into the investigation and new dangers to anyone who got too close to the truth. The first sign that something had changed came on a cold February morning in 2024, exactly 5 years after the bus excavation. Morrison arrived at his office to find his files had been moved. Not stolen, not destroyed, just carefully rearranged in a way that made it clear someone had spent considerable time reviewing every document in the case. Nothing was missing, but there was something new. Placed precisely in the center of Morrison's desk was a single photograph that hadn't been there the night before. The image showed 20 young people standing beside a yellow school bus, but these weren't the familiar yearbook photos of the Millbrook victims. These were different students, older and wearing clothing that suggested the photo had been taken much more recently. Written on the back of the photograph, in neat block letters, were 2 words that made Morrison's blood run cold. Detective Ray Morrison stared at the photograph for what felt like hours, his mind racing through possibilities that seemed to defy logic. The faces looking back at him were older, weathered by decades of life, but the bone structure was unmistakable. Emily Patterson's distinctive cheekbones, Kevin Marsh's piercing blue eyes, Luna Santos' delicate features. These were the missing students from Bus 47, aged 30 years and very much alive. The photograph had been taken recently, judging by the digital quality and the modern clothing visible in the background. But how was this possible? The forensic evidence from the excavated bus clearly indicated that all 21 victims had died inside the vehicle before burial. The DNA analysis, the chemical residue, the positioning of biological evidence, everything pointed to a mass killing using compound X47. Morrison's hands trembled as he turned the photograph over again, studying the handwriting on the back. They survived. The letters were precise, clinical, written by someone with steady hands and a methodical mind. This wasn't the work of a crank or conspiracy theorist. Someone with intimate knowledge of the case was trying to send him a message. The implications were terrifying. If the students had somehow survived, where had they been for 30 years? Why hadn't they contacted their families? And who was responsible for orchestrating what appeared to be the most elaborate deception in criminal history? Morrison locked the photograph in his evidence safe and began reviewing the case files with fresh eyes. Every piece of evidence needed to be re-examined under the assumption that the students might still be alive. If the DNA evidence from the bus was fabricated, if the chemical analysis was deliberately falsified, then someone with extraordinary resources and access had been manipulating the investigation from the very beginning. The first inconsistency Morrison noticed involved the original forensic team that had processed Bus 47 after its excavation in 2019. The lead technician, Dr. Amanda Foster, had credentials from prestigious institutions and decades of experience in criminal forensics. And her reports had been thorough and professional, her conclusions supported by multiple independent analyses. But when Morrison tried to contact Dr. Foster to discuss some technical questions about the chemical residue findings, he discovered something disturbing. According to the State Forensic Laboratory, no one named a Foster had ever been employed by their organization. The credentials listed on her reports led to universities that had no record of her enrollment. The professional references she had provided were phone numbers that had been disconnected for years. Dr. Amanda Foster, the expert whose analysis had convinced Morrison that the students were dead, did not exist. Morrison spent the next week quietly investigating every member of the 2019 forensic team. One by one, he discovered that their backgrounds were elaborate fabrications. False credentials, non-existent employment records, staged professional histories that fell apart under scrutiny. Someone had inserted an entire team of imposter scientists into the investigation, People sophisticated enough to fool experienced law enforcement officers and produce convincing but completely fraudulent evidence. The scope of the deception was staggering. Whoever was behind this had resources that rivaled those of major intelligence agencies. They had been able to manufacture false identities, produce fake scientific equipment, and generate convincing laboratory reports that had fooled some of the most experienced investigators in the state. But why go to such elaborate lengths to convince everyone the students were dead? What purpose did this massive cover-up serve? The answer came in the form of another mysterious delivery. Morrison arrived at work the following Monday to find a manila envelope waiting on his desk. Inside was a USB drive containing hundreds of documents, photographs, lists, and video files that painted a picture so disturbing it made Morrison question everything he thought he knew about the Millbrook case. The files revealed that the 20 missing students hadn't been random victims of a serial killer or tragic accident. They had been specifically selected and recruited for a classified government program known as Project Looking Glass. The program, operated jointly by the CIA and Defense Department, focused on identifying and developing individuals with exceptional cognitive abilities for intelligence work. According to the documents, each of the 20 Millbrook students had demonstrated remarkable aptitude in areas crucial to national security. Emily Patterson's mathematical genius had been noticed by Pentagon recruiters when she solved a supposedly unsolvable cryptographic puzzle published in a science magazine. Kevin Marsh's ability to detect deception through verbal analysis had caught the attention of FBI behavioral specialists. Luna Santos had written poetry that contained sophisticated coded messages she claimed came to her in dreams. The twins, Alex and Jordan Whitmore, were the crown jewels of the recruitment effort. Their synchronized thinking patterns had been identified as potentially valuable for developing new forms of encrypted communication. Military psychologists believed their mental connection could be weaponized for intelligence gathering in ways that traditional spycraft could never achieve. The recruitment process had taken months of careful planning. Government agents had posed as college admissions officers, scholarship coordinators, and academic mentors to evaluate the students without their knowledge. Psychological profiles were developed, family backgrounds investigated, and social connections mapped with military precision. The disappearance of Bus 47 hadn't been a crime at all. It had been an extraction. Video files on the USB drive showed the actual events of May 13, 1994, recorded from multiple camera angles by surveillance teams positioned along State Route 19. Bus 47 had indeed taken an unexpected route that afternoon, but not because of an accident or abduction. Thomas Brennan, the trusted school bus driver, had been working as a government contractor for over 2 years. The footage showed Bus 47 pulling into what appeared to be an abandoned gas station about 8 miles from Millbrook High School. Within minutes, several black vehicles arrived at the location. Men in military fatigues boarded the bus and spoke briefly with the students, apparently explaining the situation and requesting their cooperation. What happened next was the most chilling part of the entire operation, and the students didn't resist. They didn't scream or try to escape. Instead, they gathered their belongings calmly and transferred to the waiting vehicles with the practiced efficiency of people who had been prepared for this moment. Even Thomas Brennan seemed to be following a predetermined script, helping load student backpacks and ensuring no evidence was left behind. The final video segment showed Bus 47 being loaded onto a flatbed trailer and driven toward the Bellweather Property. The burial site had been prepared in advance, complete with heavy machinery and a team of workers who moved with military precision. The bus was lowered into the pre-dug pit, covered with soil, and the entire area was camouflaged so expertly that it remained hidden for 25 years. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Hidden in the deepest folder of the USB drive was a single document that explained the true purpose of Project Looking Glass. The 20 Millbrook students hadn't been recruited for traditional intelligence work. They were being prepared for something far more ambitious and terrifying than Morrison could have imagined. The document, classified at the highest levels of government security, outlined plans for creating what intelligence officials called cognitive weapons. The idea was to develop human beings whose mental abilities were so advanced they could infiltrate, manipulate, and control enemy intelligence networks through pure intellectual superiority. These human weapons would be deployed against hostile nations, terrorist organizations, and anyone else deemed a threat to American interests. The Millbrook students were to be the prototype for this program. According to the timeline in the classified document, the students had been taken to a secure facility in the Nevada desert where they would undergo years of intensive psychological conditioning and cognitive enhancement. Their families would be told they were dead, their former lives erased, their very identities reconstructed to serve their new purpose as weapons in an undeclared war. The program had apparently been successful beyond anyone's expectations, as Morrison found additional files showing the progress of individual students over the past 30 years. Emily Patterson had become one of the world's leading cryptographers, her mathematical abilities enhanced through experimental techniques that pushed the boundaries of human cognition. Her work had broken encryption codes that protected the communications of enemy governments, terrorist cells, and criminal organizations across the globe. Kevin Marsh had evolved into what the documents described as a human lie detector, capable of identifying deception with an accuracy rate that exceeded any technological alternative. His interrogation techniques had produced intelligence breakthroughs in cases involving national security, organized crime, and international espionage. Luna Santos had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict human behavior through analysis of written communications. Her poetry, once dismissed as teenage creativity, had become a sophisticated form of psychological warfare used to influence enemy agents and extract information from hostile sources. The twins, Alex and Jordan Whitmore, had exceeded every expectation. Their mental connection had been enhanced through experimental procedures until they functioned as a single distributed intelligence system. They could process information simultaneously, share thoughts instantaneously, and coordinate complex operations with a level of precision that traditional team-based approaches could never achieve. All 20 students had become exactly what their government handlers had hoped, living weapons of unimaginable intellectual power. But something had gone wrong with Project Looking Glass. The final set of documents on the USB drive revealed that several of the enhanced operatives had begun displaying signs of psychological instability. Potentials of cognitive manipulation and emotional conditioning had produced unintended consequences that threatened the entire program. Some agents were experiencing severe dissociative episodes, losing their sense of individual identity as their enhanced abilities overwhelmed their original personalities. Others had begun questioning the morality of their assignments, developing what program administrators described as ethical resistance to their conditioning. Emily Patterson had reportedly refused to work on a project that would have compromised the financial systems of allied nations. Kevin Marsh had walked out of an interrogation when he realized the subject was an innocent civilian caught up in a case of mistaken identity. Most troubling of all, the twins had apparently begun communicating with each other in ways that bypassed all monitoring systems. But intelligence officials suspected they were planning some form of rebellion against their handlers, possibly even an escape attempt that could expose the entire program to public scrutiny. The photograph Morrison had found on his desk wasn't just evidence that the students had survived. It was proof that they had broken free from 30 years of government control and were now somewhere in the world with cognitive abilities that made them incredibly dangerous to anyone who might try to stop them. Morrison realized he was now part of a game whose rules he didn't understand, and whose players possessed abilities far beyond anything he had encountered in traditional law enforcement. The anonymous person who had provided him with this intelligence obviously wanted him to know the truth about Project Looking Glass, but what were they hoping he would do with such information? The answer came sooner than he expected. 3 days after receiving the USB drive, Morrison was contacted by someone claiming to be Emily Patterson herself. The voice on the phone was older than he remembered from the original investigation interviews, but the speech patterns and intellectual precision were unmistakably those of the former valedictorian. "Detective Morrison," she said without preamble, I believe you have recently learned some disturbing facts about what happened to my classmates and me 30 years ago. We need to meet." Morrison's training told him to be cautious, but his curiosity overrode his professional instincts. "How do I know you are really Emily Patterson?" Because, she replied, "I'm the only person who knows that you keep a photograph of your daughter's first day of kindergarten in your wallet, right behind your detective badge. You look at it every morning before you leave for work, and you have been doing so for the past 18 years. Even though she's now in college studying criminal justice at State." Morrison's blood turned to ice. He had never told anyone about that photograph, never mentioned his morning ritual to his colleagues or even his wife. The fact that Emily Patterson knew such intimate details about his personal life demonstrated abilities that went far beyond enhanced cognition. She was reading his mind. "Don't be afraid," Emily continued, apparently sensing his terror, even through the phone connection. "What we have become isn't entirely under our control, but we are still fundamentally the same people we were when we boarded that bus in 1994. We still care about right and wrong, and we still remember our families." "What do you want from me?" Morrison managed to ask. "We want to go home," she said simply. "But first we need your help stopping the people who turned us into weapons. The Project Looking Glass didn't end with us, Detective Morrison. There are other programs, other students being taken from their families and transformed into things that should never exist. We can't allow that to continue." Emily Patterson gave Morrison an address in the mountains west of Millbrook, instructing him to come alone and to tell no one about their conversation. "Bring the files you have been given," she said. "We have more information to share, and together we might be able to prevent other families from experiencing what ours have endured for 3 decades. As Morrison prepared for what might be the most dangerous meeting of his career, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to become part of something much larger than a missing persons case. The 20 students from Bus 47 had returned from the dead, but they weren't the same people who had disappeared in 1994. They were something new, something unprecedented, something that could either save the world or destroy it completely. The mountain cabin where Emily Patterson had directed Morrison was isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry to the nearest neighbor. As he parked his unmarked police car in the gravel driveway, Morrison noticed security cameras positioned at strategic points around the property. Someone was watching his approach, evaluating his intentions, and probably reading his thoughts as easily as scanning a newspaper. Morrison had never felt so exposed in his entire life. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her late 40s whose face was unmistakably that of Emily Patterson, aged 30 years. But her eyes held depths of knowledge and pain that no normal human being could have accumulated in several lifetimes. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "The others are waiting." Inside the cabin, Morrison found himself face to face with living ghosts. 19 of the 20 missing students were present, seated around a large wooden table like participants in some cosmic council meeting. Only Thomas Brennan, the bus driver, was absent, and Emily quickly explained that he had died of natural causes 5 years earlier while still working for the program. The reunion was surreal and heartbreaking. These were people Morrison had spent decades trying to find, whose disappearance had haunted an entire community, whose families still gathered annually to remember them. But they were also strangers, transformed by experiences so alien that they seemed to belong to a different species entirely. Kevin Marsh spoke first, his voice carrying authority that commanded immediate attention. "Detective Morrison, what we are about to tell you will challenge everything you believe about government, justice, and human nature. Are you prepared for that?" Morrison nodded, though he wasn't sure he was prepared for anything anymore. What followed was a 3-hour briefing that revealed the full scope of Project Looking Glass and its successor programs. The 20 Millbrook students hadn't been the first group taken for cognitive enhancement, merely the most successful. Similar extractions had been occurring for decades, targeting gifted children from around the world and transforming them into intellectual weapons for various government agencies. The twins, Alex and Jordan Whitmore, demonstrated their enhanced abilities by simultaneously accessing Morrison's police database and several classified federal systems, pulling up files he didn't even know existed. Luna Santos showed him poetry she had written that contained encrypted intelligence reports spanning 30 years of covert operations. Emily Patterson solved mathematical equations in her head that would have required supercomputers to process. But the most chilling demonstration came from the group as a whole. Working in perfect synchronization, they accessed Morrison's own memories and played them back on a laptop screen like home movies. Childhood experiences he had forgotten, conversations he had never told anyone about, fears and dreams he had never articulated, all of it was as accessible to them as files in a computer database. "This is what they turned us into," Emily said sadly. "Living violations of human privacy, weapons designed to strip away every secret and manipulate every thought. We can read minds, predict behavior, and control decisions with an accuracy that makes free will seem like an illusion." Morrison struggled to process the implications. "Why are you telling me this? Why reveal yourselves now?" The answer came from Jordan Whitmore, one of the twins whose mental connection had been weaponized by their handlers. "Because Project Looking Glass is about to expand. They are planning to take 50 new subjects next month, all of them children between the ages of 12 and 16. 50 more families will be destroyed, 50 more young people will lose their humanity to become tools of government power. We can't allow that to happen," Alex Whitmore added, his thoughts seamlessly continuing his twin's statement. "We have the ability to stop them, but we need legitimate law enforcement authority to make our actions legal rather than vigilante justice." Morrison realized what they were asking him to do. They wanted him to provide official sanction for what would essentially be a war between enhanced human beings and the intelligence apparatus that had created them. And the 20 former students possessed abilities that could probably defeat any conventional military response. But they still wanted to operate within the legal system that had failed to protect them 30 years earlier. "What about your families?" Morrison asked. "Mon, don't they deserve to know you are alive?" The question triggered a wave of visible pain across the group. These were people who had been forced to abandon everyone they loved, to become ghosts in their own lives, to watch from hiding as parents aged and died without ever knowing their children had survived. "We have been home," Emily said quietly. "All of us have visited our families over the years, watched them from a distance, even interacted with them in disguised forms. But we can never truly return to our old lives. What we have become would terrify the people who love us." Luna Santos nodded in agreement. "My mother remarried 8 years ago. She named her new daughter Luna Maria, after me. I have been her daughter's unofficial guardian angel for years, making sure she stays safe, guiding her toward good decisions. But I can never tell her who I really am or why I care so much about her welfare." And the tragedy of their situation was overwhelming. These people had been given godlike cognitive abilities, but the price had been their basic humanity. They could read minds and predict the future, but they could never again experience the simple pleasure of normal human relationships. Morrison made his decision. "What do you need from me?" The plan they outlined was ambitious and dangerous. Using their enhanced abilities, the former students had identified the locations where the next group of children was being held for evaluation. They had mapped the security systems, profiled the personnel involved, and developed strategies for extracting the young victims without violence. But they needed Morrison to coordinate with federal authorities who weren't part of Project Looking Glass to ensure that the exposure of the program would lead to genuine reform rather than simply driving it deeper underground. "There are good people in government," Kevin Marsh assured him. "Agents and officials who would be horrified to learn what's been done in the name of national security. But they are outnumbered by those who believe that any sacrifice is justified if it serves American interests." Morrison agreed to serve as their liaison with legitimate authorities, but first he had one more question. "What happens to all of you after this is over? Where do you go from here?" The 20 enhanced individuals exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. Finally, Emily Patterson answered for the group. "We are going to disappear again," she said. "But this time it will be our choice. We will use our abilities to help people, to prevent tragedies, to guide humanity toward better decisions. We will be guardian angels working in the shadows, protecting a world that will never know we exist. Morrison left the mountain cabin that night with a sense of purpose, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Within 24 hours, he would initiate a chain of events that would bring down Project Looking Glass and expose 30 years of illegal human experimentation. The children scheduled for extraction would be returned to their families, the officials responsible for the program would face justice, and the world would learn that the boundaries of human potential extended far beyond anything previously imagined. But he would also carry the weight of knowing that 20 extraordinary people would never again be able to live normal lives, and that their sacrifice had purchased safety for others at the cost of their own humanity. 3 months later, Detective Ray Morrison received a final photograph in the mail. It showed 20 middle-aged people standing together in what appeared to be an airport, their faces peaceful but marked by the kind of wisdom that comes only through unimaginable suffering. They were dressed for travel, carrying luggage that suggested a long journey ahead. Written on the back, in the same precise handwriting that had started this chapter of the investigation, were 4 words that would haunt Morrison for the rest of his life. "Thank you, we are free." The 20 students who had vanished on Bus 47 in 1994 had finally completed their journey home, not to the families and community they had left behind, but to a new understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where the impossible had become inevitable. Morrison never saw them again, but sometimes in quiet moments when he was working on particularly difficult cases, he would feel a presence watching over him, a gentle guidance that led him toward truth, a subtle protection that kept him safe from dangers he never quite recognized. The guardian angels of Millbrook were still watching over their community, invisible but never truly gone.